One of the best parts about football is definitely the rivalries. And I feel like whenever there's a conversation about the biggest rivalries in the world, one country that's surprisingly not mentioned for the big clashes is England. Sure, there are some enormous games, and there are definitely still some massive rivalries. Manchester United and Liverpool and Arsenal Tottenham come to mind. But whenever there's a conversation about the truly big heated ones, England just isn't in that conversation. And I want to focus on a specific rivalry today, and that is between what, in my opinion, is the two biggest clubs in London, Arsenal and Chelsea. Now, surprisingly for these teams being rivals, there has been a lot of business that's went on between the two over the years.
It's just good business.
And it's hard to say that Arsenal come out of this on top. Chelsea have definitely been getting the better of this deal for a long time. And that's what I want to look at today. Why is there this weird transfer imbalance that goes on between Chelsea and Arsenal? Why do Arsenal keep going back to shopping players from Chelsea? So before we dive in, I want to point out two very obvious things. The first is that although there's a lot of players in recent years that's gone from Chelsea to Arsenal, there have been a lot of players who have either gone directly from Arsenal or have been very heavily associated with Arsenal that have went to Chelsea. The three main ones being Ashley Cole, Olivier Giroud and Cesc Fabregas. All three of those players have either went on to win the Premier League, the Champions League or both at Chelsea. So it's very hard to argue anything against any of those signings from a Chelsea point of view. However, when you look at some of the recent players that came from Arsenal, it's not the same. One other point I want to emphasise before we start to look at some of these players who have went from the blue side of London to the red is that I understand that for a lot of these players, when their time is up at Chelsea, the move to Arsenal can be very promising, and I think this is a big part of the selling factor as to why Arsenal keep going for these players. I believe they see them as getting pretty good deals on players who are probably not coming in and being promised a lot of game time because they get to stay in London. And to be honest, if you want to be competitive in London and you aren't at Chelsea, your only other choice is Arsenal. Because you are ultimately going to struggle to win trophies at Brentford, Crystal Palace or Tottenham. So, let's start with our first player in the last 10 years who's left Chelsea and gone to Arsenal. So let's start with Petr Cech. He left Chelsea in July 2015 to move to Arsenal. After 11 years at Chelsea, he would spend 4 years at Arsenal, and to be honest, in his first season he was actually very good. Across 139 games for Arsenal, he would win an FA Cup and 2 Community Shields if you count those. And considering he only signed for the club for around about 14 million euros, you could absolutely consider this a relatively good signing. Don't get me wrong, towards the later stages of his time at Arsenal, it was very, very clear that he was well past the point where he should be looking at retiring. And of course it would be hard to forget his final game, which was comical in the way it went. A European final for Arsenal. He was beaten 4-1 by Chelsea when he had a job lined up at Chelsea for after his contract at Arsenal ended to go back to his original club in a technical role.
Oh wait, you serious? Let me laugh even harder.
He was eventually replaced by Bernd Leno, but all in all, this wasn't a dreadful signing for Arsenal. The next player we're going to look at is David Luiz. Now, he did move from Chelsea to Arsenal for only about 9 million euros, so in that sense it was a very modest fee. And that was in August 2019. He would be at the club until June 2021, and he would also win an FA Cup at Arsenal. However, I feel like if you ask any Arsenal fan, their opinion on David Luiz would not be generous. The defender was there during the completely comical COVID-19 season, and was ultimately a shadow of the player at Arsenal that he was when he was at Chelsea. Constant mistakes and just a lack of quality, he was clearly a stopgap signing for Arsenal. All in all, he absolutely wasn't anything to be proud of, and you can't argue in any way that this was a successful signing, and it probably should have started to ring the alarm bells for Arsenal immediately. Our next player was Willian, another Brazilian leaving Chelsea, and he would join a year after David Luiz did. Now, Willian goes between two places. It's hard to criticise him because he was a free transfer, but he was on a lot of money. And to be honest, he was dreadful during his time at Arsenal. The one season he was there, he would play 37 games, he'd only score once and pick up 5 assists. 6 of those 8 goal involvements were in the league. Again, that was during the very comical COVID times for Arsenal. And it was very clear that Willian took the move to Arsenal, in my opinion, because he was getting a very generous wage and he got to stay in London, as I mentioned earlier. He would leave the club to go to Corinthians and then come back to London to play for Fulham. All in all, it's hard to call Willian a successful signing. Not a bad signing, but hard to call him a successful one. Arsenal didn't keep him past that original year, and again, it was another player who you have to say, not a great move by Arsenal. The next player we're going to look at is Jorginho. Now, Jorginho's a weird one because he took a lot of criticism during his time at Chelsea, whilst actually being very successful. He wouldn't win anything during his time at Arsenal, however at Chelsea he did win a Club World Cup, a Super Cup, a Champions League, a Europa League and a Euros with Italy, at one point placing third in the Ballon d'Or list. And he would only sign for Arsenal for around €12 million in January 2023. And to be honest, out of all of the players we're going to cover in this list, I think either Jorginho or Petr Cech have to be considered the most successful of the signings. At a time where Arsenal were really starting to build up, Jorginho, for a modest fee, in my opinion, was a pretty good signing. A midfielder who could really help control things, really help Arteta out, a bit of experience for a few years, and then left without a fuss. I think Jorginho is one of the more overly criticised players that we've seen in the Premier League in recent years. And to be fair, I don't think this was an overly bad signing for Arsenal. Okay, now we move into one of the controversial ones. Kai Havertz. After winning the Champions League at Chelsea, scoring the winner in the final, but not really being that great for Chelsea past that, he would leave Chelsea in June 2023 to sign for Arsenal for a massive €75 million. And during his time at Arsenal, I think Kai Havertz has been one of the most frustrating players ever to watch. He hasn't won a thing at Arsenal. However, I feel like their fans are desperate to justify this signing because of the bad reputation that Arsenal have for the amount of players that they've taken from Chelsea in recent years. Because I'm not sure what he's supposed to be. For the most part, Havertz plays as a striker for Arsenal, or around about that area. But it feels like the one thing that's been missing from Arsenal's team for years has been a striker to take them to that next level. He scored 29 goals in 87 games. And to be honest, this for me is one of Arsenal's worst ones. I find it really difficult to try and justify for them why you would spend all that money on a striker who was already failing at another Premier League club. And Havertz has done himself no favours. So far, he's got a pretty small legacy to potentially leave at Arsenal, and he's absolutely burned his bridges with Chelsea. When you take all of that into consideration, it was a gamble by Arsenal, and I think it was a gamble that didn't work. Havertz is still there, and there's obviously plenty of time for him to prove me and everyone else doubting him wrong, but for now, I don't think that was a great signing at all. The final player we're going to cover that is a confirmed transfer is Kepa Arrizabalaga. And again, this one for me doesn't seem too bad. He's been signed by Arsenal for around about €6 million, and it's very clear he's been brought in as a backup goalkeeper to David Raya. And I don't think this is necessarily a bad deal, considering how small a fee it is for a goalkeeper who's happy to sit on the bench, I assume. He's getting that under this message that he's going to get to stay in London because he's just moving from Chelsea to Arsenal. They're in the same city. He doesn't have to relocate. And again, you can see why a lot of players would be desperate to stay in London. It's the capital, of course. So for me, this deal isn't too bad. It's one of the better ones, and it's one of the ones that could make more sense for Arsenal. He was Bournemouth's number 1 last season, and it's hard to say that he had an overly bad season. He certainly looked more impressive than what he did when he was at Chelsea. And the final player we're going to cover is Noni Madueke. Now, Madueke hasn't signed for Arsenal, but he is heavily linked with them. I don't think anything will be confirmed until Chelsea are finished with the Club World Cup. And it's confusing to say whether this would be a good signing for Arsenal or not. However, the vibe I've got from the Arsenal fan base is that they don't really want this transfer to go ahead. They'd rather the money was spent elsewhere. So looking back at all of these players, some of them were successful signings and some of them definitely weren't. But you can see where the logic's coming from Arsenal. They definitely have a pull factor for all of these players that feels much more important for them, given that it's giving them the opportunity to stay in London and fight for trophies. So you would have to say that Arsenal are using their size and strengths well. So why are so many Arsenal fans against this transfer model? Again, it comes back to the rivalry. The fans clearly feel more of a rivalry, in my opinion, than the club does. And the problem that this creates is you're giving Chelsea an outweigh for all of these players that Chelsea basically consider dead wood, or players that they're ready to move on from. Players that have been at Chelsea that have overstayed their welcome and are starting to cause problems, and Arsenal fans are watching that and rejoicing from seeing problems at their rival clubs. They're then going and buying these problems, and most of the time it doesn't work out. And in cases like players with Kai Havertz, you really feel as if they're almost overcompensating with how much they really want that transfer to work, to try and justify all of this constant banter that they keep receiving for continually taking one of their rivals' dead wood. On paper, a lot of these signings aren't anywhere near as bad as they're made out to be. However, on grass, some of them have been far worse than Arsenal expected. But that's just my thoughts on this very, very weird transfer model. I'd be very interested to hear what you guys have to say in the comments below. I'd love to hear an Arsenal fan's point of view on it, and a Chelsea fan's, to see how both teams think. Just want to thank everyone who's made it this far into the video. I'll release a video as soon as I can on the finals of the Club World Cup, and I'll see everyone in the next one.